Good morning. Our last regularly scheduled class. Because next week, all we have is the final session, which is a double session, which starts at 10 o'clock instead of the regular time. And I will be here the whole time. That's my last requirement, other than turning in grades, etc., to be here for the whole required. All my tests are online. Remember, even if you're not coming physically to class, you should be able to do fine with my class, because I do post videos if you try to follow along. They're not mandatory, because remember, they're such poor quality, they don't satisfy the minimum requirement for that kind of thing. But there they are. But no, all my requirements are via email, the quiz responses, the 3 tests, and the term paper. So that's it. I'm actually much more concerned that you get what you paid for out of the class than grades are mandatory, right? You have to do that. And actually, every semester I have some people fail my class. You have to really work hard to fail my class. But there are people that manage it. They sign up and they never come, or they never email me, or they email me once and say, I'm in your class, and here's my 10 commandments, and then they never send me anything else. I don't know why that happens, but it happens every semester with at least 1 or 2 people, which is actually good, because when the dean looked at my grading, he said, oh, you fail some people, that's good. So, I meet goal, I fail some people. But I didn't explain, well, that's because they didn't do anything, So, but that's how that works, as far as I'm concerned. I used to be stricter about things, of course, and all of that. And in fact, one of the things I'd like to talk about today is plagiarism and why. That's kind of a fun thing. I didn't do a very good job on Derrida, and I apologize. It's true, though, that I'm not a fluent speaker of deconstruction or postmodernism. I'm a little bit more familiar with, because it's not just a French thing. We're postmodernists officially ourselves, whether we like it or not. We can still be neo-pragmatists too. You can always be a couple things at once. Kind of like the Chinese, when the Christian missionaries came, they wanted to convert them to Christianity, and said, oh, we'll add that too. But they still stayed Buddhist, and they still stayed Confucianist, because the Chinese didn't think that they were mutually exclusive things, because they don't believe in the law of non-contradiction, of course. So that works out really well in Chinese. Let me show you what I decided. I found someone who apparently is a fluent speaker of Derrida, or you've met her before, and let me...
Congratulations! You made it to the final video of class. So excited to share this with you. Today we are talking about Jacques Derrida, who is known as the father of deconstruction. And we're thinking a little bit about a particular word that Derrida employs in order to destabilize the very meaning of words, the very meaning of life, the very meaning of everything, and that is différance. Or différence, if you want to be fancy about it. Différance in French is Derrida's kind of funky spelling of the word for difference, which is spelled the same way that it is in English. So he puts an A at the beginning of the 3rd syllable, right, instead of an E. The French word différance spelled correctly, so with an E, unlike in English, actually has 2 meanings. It means both difference in the way we mean it in English, so this book is different from this other book, but it also means deferral. So something is deferred in time. So it has both a material sense and a temporal sense. For Derrida, given meanings are always context relative. And they're also always in a state of being positioned only in relation to other meanings. So think about, for instance, the way that the word dog makes sense only because the word dog is different from the word cat, is different from the word wolf, is different from the word horse. The word dog is not a present entity unto itself with a bunch of content. Actually, those three letters have no bearing on actual dogs in the world.
That's from the Rite of the Valkyries, Wagner. So, not really Valkyries, they're puppies. Cute though.
The meaning of the word dog has no essential connection to the word dog itself. It's arbitrary. But it gains its positive content through its difference from other words. Now that idea that I just articulated is one that comes from structuralism. Derrida has his own particular twist on this idea, which goes by the name deconstruction. And Derrida's claim is that it's not just that the word dog gets its meaning by being different from the word cat and being different from the word wolf. Even the meaning of the word dog is always sort of haunted by those other words, such that its meaning is never even fixed as absent. It's always kind of slipping around. There are traces of other words. There are traces of what goes beyond words in the word dog, in any word, in anything. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that it's very important to understand that Derrida is always trying to deconstruct binaries. Binary oppositions for him only ever appear to be binary oppositions. One side of the binary actually always gets its meaning from the other side and vice versa. And you might think that this is pretty similar to a dialectical way of thinking, and you wouldn't be wrong in seeing some similarities there. But for Derrida, a dialectical way of thinking is still focused on the way that contradictions are resolved, right? For Hegel, for instance, we've got a thesis and antithesis that resolves into a sublation. In Derrida's view, contradictions are always messy. They're inherent to our modes of understanding. They're not meant to be straightened out or sublated. And they're not in service of a higher truth. There's no teleology behind that. One of the binaries that Derrida takes issue with in this text is the binary between speech and writing. A lot of times we tend to think about speech as primary, right? Speech comes first and then writing comes second. In a historical sense, okay, yes, humans had oral cultures before we got written cultures, but for Derrida, speech gets its meaning in and through its difference from writing. And here you see a classic move of Derridian deconstruction. I just want to break down a couple moves for you here. First move is to identify an opposition, in this case, speech and writing. The second move is to say that that seeming opposition is not neutral. One of the terms is privileged over the other. So a binary opposition is always actually a hierarchical opposition. The third move is to deconstruct that opposition by showing that it is far less stable than it appears to be. One of the ways that Derrida tends to do this, and you might call this a fourth step, but you might also say it's part of the third step, either would be fine, is that Derrida tends to temporarily privilege the traditionally underprivileged term of the binary. So he says, oh, you thought that writing was dependent on speech? Well, let me show you the ways that speech is actually dependent on writing. But in doing that, he's not saying like, writing's better than speech, writing's more primary than speech. He is showing that the two terms of the opposition are so distinctly intertwined that it no longer makes sense to think of them as an opposition at all. So this temporary privileging of that traditionally underprivileged term turns out to deconstruct the binary altogether. And to
It's just like Hegel's servant, the master servant.
Going back to the term difference, Derrida wants to show the play of differences, this proliferating field of differences, and not differences that we can just count up, but differences that are traces of other differences, that are not only context specific, but also in some relevant sense absent. And in doing so, we're saying that difference is not a singular thing, right? Differences aren't singular. Opposition does not just involve one difference between one term and another. What's interesting for writing
The text doesn't follow her speech at all, does it?
Absence of its referent. So, for instance, we can still read Shakespeare's words hundreds of years after Shakespeare wrote them, and hundreds of years after Shakespeare died, right? We don't actually need Shakespeare to be there in order to read him, which is not true of Shakespeare's speech. This peculiar characteristic of writing, Derrida suggests, is also existent in speech itself. Think about the way that speech requires a sense of punctuation. You can tell the difference right now, even as I'm speaking in a consistent stream of words, between one word and another. You are, in a sense, imagining the space between them. You're also imagining the period between sentences. Writing reveals the absence that marks language by showing that language can exist in the absence of its referent. But this very same absence that marks writing also marks speech. It just marks it a bit differently through, say, the imagined spaces or absences between words. In emphasizing that writing has a certain priority over speech, it partakes in the same structure as speech, but it reveals it in a more illustrative fashion. Derrida is trying to undermine what he calls logocentrism. Logocentrism is the emphasis, the focus, the trust in logos, which is a Greek word that we've encountered before in class that can mean speech, that can mean word, that can mean law. There can also be study of as in ecology. Logocentrism privileges the phoneme, the spoken, over the grapheme, the written. And this privileging of speech over writing that we find in logocentrism also pertains to the privileging of reason, also pertains to the privilege of subjectivity, also pertains to the privilege of consciousness and presence over absence, over the unconscious, over what is outside of the grasp of reason. And Derrida not only articulates these ideas in this text, he also performs them. Because the term différance in French, the term with an A, sounds exactly the same as différance with an E. So I said that différance with an E in French just means difference and deferral. It's a totally standard French word. Différance with an A is Derrida's own neologism. He just made it up. But you can only distinguish in French between différance with an A and différance with an E in writing. They sound exactly the same. Différence, différence. No difference. That is one of the ways that Derrida tries to show that actually, in a sense, writing has a leg up on speech. Although keep in mind that that leg up is only temporary because he ultimately wants to deconstruct that binary. Now, Derrida writes in a manner that is often very frustrating, especially to first-time readers, because he'll say things like, différance is neither a concept nor a word. For heuristic purposes, to help you understand this, I have put it in terms that seem pretty straightforwardly conceptual, and I've analyzed it as a word. But you always have to take these heuristics with a grain of salt, because Derrida is working in a much trickier field, in a much more complicated way, in a way where he's playing on our standard modes of knowing and trying to encourage us to think differently. One of the things he's encouraging us to think differently about in this text, just as one of many examples, is the binary between passive and active. He says that philosophy has been unable to think the middle voice, which is somewhere outside of passivity and activity. It's in the middle between them, but it's also in a sense beyond them. Difference is at work in meaning, but not at work in the sense of being a kind of active force, say, of spirit. We have to try and think about it outside of an active force on the one hand.